Why didn't we listen to her? Oh, why did we not listen to her? Okay, got that out of my system, because honestly, the worst I could say about this show was that it was mid as all hell. Oh, don't get me wrong, there are some very disagreeable elements that we'll get to in this very video essay, but frankly, when I saw the first episode, I was already kind of tempering my expectations. This was an okayish first episode. Again, like the opening, nothing bad at all in this one, but also nothing that really makes it stand out. Thus, by the end, I wouldn't say I was too disappointed, so it didn't frustrate me as much as other series. Yes, I did lose my cool a few times with the weekly reviews, but one, as you just saw, I like to be dramatic, and two, you try and do this stuff on a weekly basis without going a little crazy. Point is that while the series has a ton of issues and has made me rethink some of my former bottom tier shows, I think on its own it's just a very below average show that I'll sooner completely forget about than hold any ill will towards. That said though, I do think the show symbolizes a much bigger issue that this franchise as a whole has been having for a while now and does legitimately frustrate me. An identity crisis. Now, recently, I've seen discussions on whether or not Precure should be more of a kid show. A fine discussion to have, though honestly, I do kind of feel it to be a little moot, as first, we have to define what sort of kid show Precure is. I mean, let's face it, every quote-unquote kid show has their own definition of what qualifies as for kids. This can further vary depending on the culture and the time period. Thus, when considering that latter point, any long-running franchise is going to inevitably experience some variance. Theoretically, not a lot, as they should at least try to keep to the same core themes and ideas across the series, more so if it's all maintained by the same company, like it is with many of Toei's major properties. In Precure's case, I would say they've stuck to that core for the most part, or at least more than their tokusatsu brethren, due in part to having the shortest relative tenure and not being cancelled for about a decade. However, while the core has been there, the actual application and execution of these ideas have been dodgy to say the least in recent years, with Delicious Party having easily the worst case of this. So, how did we end up here? Well, there's a plethora of reasons why. Of course, a lot of it was the result of the staff they chose, and possibly other ill-conceived and rushed ideas after a couple of years worth of uncontrollable misfortune for this franchise. Thus, while not all of the show's follies can be pinned entirely on itself and the staff, I do think it was always doomed to have some serious issues with its production, and especially its writing. With that, let's take a deeper dive and try to figure out what the core of Precure is, and what the creators of this show just didn't get about it, as we take a look at Delicious Party Precure. First things first, we may as well address the elephant in the room that is this. Unquestionably, this hacking incident was very unfortunate and did have an effect on this show early on. This was visibly evident when Amane was haphazardly added to the first ending sequence as though she was forced to perform via Skype or something. Then again, with all those recent surges, maybe she was just being quarantined. Okay, but seriously, this is likely done because the completion of the second ending theme of the show had likely been scheduled for a little later in the production run. And with Asahi Broadcasting's very inflexible airing schedule, they likely had to cut about 5 episodes. So with that, like Healing Good, I'm sure we can excuse a lot of this show's issues, right? Well, even with as much as I like that show, Healing Good did have some inherent writing issues, and even more so with this show, I think. In fact, I can actually point to the exact moment when this show started to show its cracks. From there, I honestly just kind of half-jokingly made a counting gag for every time the narrator would provide unnecessary exposition and or ruin a perfectly good emotional moment. And how much did we end up by the end of the series? Oh my god. And I remind you, this started from episode 2, almost a full month before the hacking incident, and it continued to aggravate me along with another overused element that we'll get to later. Regardless, this, along with some references to the previous series, did make it seem like Sawako Hirabayashi wasn't all that comfortable in her position as the head writer of the show. After all, if you have to rely on a third-person narrator to tell and not show a lot of the emotions of the characters, then you likely have little confidence in your own writing ability. And if you have to make callbacks to what came before, well, not only is that kind of nostalgia baiting, but it also implies that you're only applying old tropes to make it seem like you know what you're doing, whilst lacking much of the nuance of the old. This would especially become apparent once we reach the biggest early stumbling block for the show, the Gento/Amane arc. Now again, some of this arc's shortcomings might not have been entirely the show's fault. As we just went over, about a month's worth of episodes needed to be dropped, and at least a few of them had to have come from this first arc. I mean, okay, let's first try to theorize when they started to remove episodes from the lineup. Obviously, we can confirm that the first 8 episodes went on with no real problem, as their titles and summaries were released well before the hack. And from there, the team would get their first new weapon upgrade a couple episodes later in 10. Thus, this is likely where we could have lost at least one episode, either before or after episode 9, as evidenced by the fact that generally episode 11 is the upgrade episode, with the only exceptions recently being this and Tropical Rouge, which had the excuse of airing late due to Healing Goods COVID delays. Personally, I think it came after, so let's just call this missing episode 9.5. I also feel like there might be an episode missing between 10 and 11, as it does feel a little weird that they introduced 2 new finishers in one episode, so let's include an episode 10.5. And from there, I think things played out as originally planned. The actual dental arc ended on episode 12 with Amane's purification, and she was put on the bus for several weeks before returning in episode 17, and 18 saw her cure debut. With that in mind, would a couple more episodes help with the pacing issues of this arc? Well, maybe, though honestly, I'm not convinced just based on what we did get here. If you want to hear more of my general thoughts about this arc, you can check out the second part of a toy duality video where we discuss the 6 Rangers of Precure and Super Sentai. Specifically for this case, we compared Amane's arc with Jiro from Dome Brothers, ending with me predicting that the latter was going to have a much more interesting arc by the end. And yeah, while Jiro's arc didn't really end the greatest, I do have to still say, I like the Schizo Sentai a lot more. However, to quickly summarize that video, I feel like this arc was only slightly emulating multiple 6 Ranger arcs across Precure, Sentai, and even Power Ranger, rest in peace by the way, and yet never recreated the nuance or even produced their own unique take on the trope. This was mostly due to the fact that the central characters of this arc were grossly underdeveloped. We'll get to Yui later, but the writers really shot themselves in the foot by going with the constant personality struggle between Amane and Gentle, as unlike with Toa and Twilight, where the latter was in total control until the personality was erased by her own mother, Gentle was never really developed as a character, or at least an interesting one, due to being an inconsistent anti-villain who tried to reduce casualties by creating monsters that would create mass panic. And yet somehow they were able to theorize that she was a good person all along, and not just that Rosemary was quick to activate the delicious field each time, which he also proceeded to do with the later 2 generals. This, along with the test episode, where it really should have been easy to spot that she switched out the Cure's test, were some of the early examples of the show's really poor writing. Thus, I'm just not convinced they would be able to flesh her out that much more, even with a couple more episodes. Hell, if they really mattered, they could have included the theoretical episode 10.5 if they got rid of one of the episodes where Amane was absent. Specifically, in my opinion at least, the entirely pointless episode 16 where Ron dealt with an annoying consummate liar and didn't really develop her own character, though the issues with her arc is another talking point altogether. Point is that even if the hack had affected these first 18 episodes, there was never a solid basis for Gento/Amane's arc due to some pretty poorly thought out plot points that relied a lot on that tell, don't show habit that the show was already displaying well before the incident. Some of my commenters even said that they had dropped the show after these episodes, and honestly, I can't say they missed much. Aside from the one legitimately excellent episode 21, which as I keep saying we'll get to later, the middle part of the series was just that mid for the most part.
Yeah, you might have noticed, but compared to other overviews we've done, there's a lot less main plot to summarize, as this show kind of spins its wheels for much of the series. The reason behind this being that Godatz, the main villain of the show, was such a non-presence throughout much of it. Now, to be fair, there was justification behind this, as Fennel likely had his day job to worry about and had to keep up appearances so as not to arouse suspicion. Granted, that's not a hard task, as these royals couldn't see a coup coming from 2 feet away.
Still, I have enjoyed series with not a whole lot of plot progression, and some have even become my favorites of this franchise, so what's the problem here? Well, I think that can be best summed up with that one episode that resulted in me putting up this community tab.
There was just so much wrong with episode 31 that I ironically think it became a microcosm for all of my issues with this show. One, it's a story that's been told many times before, not so much in Precure, at least not to my recollection, but more so in media in general. Fair enough, as The Prince and the Pauper can be used as a great commentary about the class divides that can be found in any culture, though that wasn't the focus of this. Nor was it a spotlight of the cure of the episode, Yui, who hadn't really gotten an episode to herself since the very first. Instead, it was just an idiot plot about an evil cousin who tried to overthrow the prince, or princess of the story, by just making her late to a speech, which she could have been forgiven for on the grounds of being kidnapped, along with a bunch of loyal eyewitnesses, you dumb Prince Harry wannabe. But yeah, even though the princess and her kingdom would make a few more appearances later, she didn't really need to encounter the Precure for those events to play out. Thus, this was just pure filler that could have been better used for actual main plot, or as we keep saying, character development for the supposed lead of the show.
And yet, the most aggravating part of this episode was actually who wrote it, Sawako Hirabayashi.
Not even just ideally, a head writer in general should focus on writing some strong tempo episodes for any show. They don't necessarily have to be great episodes, but they should benefit the pacing and story structure. This is the point where it really started to become apparent that they didn't even really know what sort of show they were writing for, as even the food was barely featured here, other than Amane's brothers encouraging the princess to eat her dessert first, which, yeah, is a legit terrible lesson to teach the target audience, but more on that later.
Ultimately, and while I personally think this was the worst episode of the series, I also think that Sawako's next episode was structurally even worse and would end up sinking the show, as they ended up tackling one trope that this franchise has a really hard time with: time travel.
Now, to be fair, time travel stories aren't always easy to write for, as often they require a lot of narrative cogs that, if ignored, could result in plot holes. Hell, even some of my favorite interpretations of this trope have their fair share of inconsistencies, but not so much that they raise too many questions, or worse yet, throw off the main plot for me. And while Miracle Leap managed to pull off a Groundhog Day loop fairly well, Hakuto's incorporation of it was sloppy, though so were a lot of that season's plots. And yet, this series' application of it was especially egregious, as to put simply,
didn't even try. How does that feel?
In spite of early on establishing basic rules like avoiding paradoxes and butterfly effects, they just as quickly negated those rules by saying that Kokone would be able to erase everyone's memories, even though there are still other ways butterfly effects can occur, but whatever. My main issue is that they don't even keep that plot contrivance consistent, as not only does Ginger get to keep his memories, but they also seemingly motivate him into creating a heart collecting machine that would pretty much overtake the endgame of this show.
We'll get to that in the next section, but first, let's talk about all the time travel inconsistencies here.
One, the whole reason they traveled back in time was because Pom Pom and Memdragon had their memories of the event reawakened, so that would either mean that they were always meant to go back in time to motivate Ginger into enacting his plans, thereby creating a bootstrap paradox, or Ginger was always planning to create this device for unclarified reasons. Either way, it's not explained well. 2, it ended up creating a massive plot hole in his stupid wallet, as apparently there was always an extra delicious stone in there, even though there was an episode where Rosemary ended up emptying the wallet, and yet the stone wasn't there. So, like, are they going by Back to the Future rules, where future events can be overwritten, and their encounter with him encouraged him to give him an extra stone, but then that wouldn't match up with the aforementioned bootstrap paradox that says everything is preordained and...
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
You see what I mean when I say they didn't even try to make sense of any of this?
They basically used and abused Doctor Who's timey-wimey nonsense to the point that Kokone became a Time Lord herself. Though yeah, for no particular reason, it was revealed that Kokone the First, on top of being male, sacrificed himself to complete the creation of Ginger's device, which isn't that just a great message to teach the kids? If there's an unconfirmed danger on the horizon, just off yourself for the benefit of people you just met.
I mean, come on, even the Doctor has limited number of revive. Oh wait, they kind of retconned that away thanks to the Timeless Child, didn't they? Well, that would explain the pointless gender bending.
Point is that this episode was a rushed, disorganized mess that only got worse in hindsight as we entered into the final arc.
One descriptor I ended up using a lot for the writing of the show was backwards.
Plot points that should have been established early on instead occurred near the tail end of events. Case in point, Yui's character arc, which instead of progressing naturally throughout the series, was backloaded into the final 7 episodes of the series, whilst competing for screen time with the main plot that revolved almost entirely around the Cook Fighters. Yeah, the Cook Fighters, who had been more of a background element, especially Takumi, ended up taking over the final arc, with the final battle being more about the conflict between Godatz and Ginger. As a result, it just became a disjointed climax, as while the show desperately tried to present Yui as the main character, in spite of the poor build to it, ultimately she, and really the Precure in general, were secondary players while these guys took over. I mean, yeah, it should be pretty obvious in a magical girl show that the title characters should take priority over a team of men, hence them not getting too much attention for much of the series made sense, and yet here, they're treated like the main characters, with the villain being a former member of theirs, and the thing that mostly led to his defeat wasn't the strong, undying resolve of the Precure, like it would be in any other season, but rather...
What the fudge pickle?
Which just brings up even more questions like, did Ginger know Fennel would go over the deep end? If not, then why make these many insane contingencies for an evil that was only vaguely described to him by people claiming to be from the future? Which again, why establish they're not supposed to rewrite the past when it became one of the biggest keys to their victory?
It just don't add up!
Yeah, there's just no getting around it. This ending was structurally a mess, like trying to throw everything possible into a hot pot, not considering that there are just some things that you can't throw in as it won't mesh well with what's already there. Ginger, on top of being a cringy old man furry, really brought down this final arc with his introduction and all of the plot elements he brought with him at the 11th hour.
It was so bad that you'd almost think that this guy should have been the main villain.
Yeah, the writers really played it up like Ginger was going to be Godatz, and you know, to their credit, their red herring worked, at least on me. I mean, the fact that the big bad always appeared in the image of a cat and had his underlings wear bones on their outfits for no particular reason did have me fooled.
And you know, looking back on it, yeah, I still think this old geezer should have been the big bad.
And it's not just because I genuinely don't like this character, but more importantly, it would have given a bigger role to Yui, and by extension, the other Precure, because he was associated with all of their parents, and especially Yone. You know, the person Yui cared a lot about to the point that she pretty much based her whole character around her. Just imagine if someone she had regarded as a close friend had post-mortem used all of her food quotes and turned them back against our protagonist, essentially belittling her beliefs whilst using them as the basis for his tyrannical conquest, using his device that he had tricked the fairy partners into helping him create, with one of them even dying in the process.
Seriously, y'all had a potentially much more interesting villain, and while he was a little out of nowhere, at least he would have been a devious bastard, and not just a furry bastard.
Now, I'm not saying this one change would necessarily save the show, as it still does have a lot of other problems, but it would have at least made the final battle a lot more personal, and even push our heroines harder, as they wouldn't have what effectively became a deus ex machina for how much work it put in instead of them.
Hell, you don't even have to imagine it that hard, as they did kind of do this plot in the movie.
Sure, Kate Sith never met Yone, but he did end up misusing her quotes as the basis for his evil plot to lure children away from their parents in order to enact his plans to dollify all of them. This forced Yui to have a much more meaningful introspection about how not all of her granny's quotes could apply to everyone and everything, which, considering that this movie is in fact canon to the main series, kind of doesn't match up with this finale.
But I guess that's what happens when you bring in a more experienced writer who can rework the ingredients placed in front of him. And really, that brings us to my ultimate point of what we've been building towards with this video. I just think the writers of the show didn't get Precure, or even the main theme of cooking.
While Sawako Hirabayashi has her own laundry list of issues that we'll get to in just a minute, the secondary writers certainly didn't help matters for the most part, as they lacked the experience with this franchise. In fact, for some of them, their experience for writing for anime in general ranged from nothing, like Junpei Yamaoka, who had previously stuck with live action, writing for Kishiru Sentai Ryu Soldier, to a few scattered, non-Precure series like Chiaki Nagai and Yuki Tanihata. The one outlier amongst all of them was Mutsumi Ito, who has been secondary writing for this franchise since Fresh. And, not too surprisingly, she at least wrote some of the most solid episodes of the series, and probably single-handedly wrote the most consistent character arc in this show, who again we'll get to later. However, considering that her, Sawako, and Kaori Kaneko were the only Precure writers, and the latter two had only really written a handful of episodes for Healing Good, it was clear the show's writing staff was ill-suited, like a kitchen staff made mostly of informally trained chefs.
Yeah, what is that?
Undercooked.
Undercooked.
That said, even if they did bring in a few more experienced veterans beyond just Ito, I'm not convinced that they would have been able to do much if the head chef didn't know what they were doing.
Just based on what I could glean from an interview she did for Animage magazine, Sawako Hirabayashi just came off as a writer who wasn't ready for her head position. She stated that she had spoken with producer Kaori Yasumi and director Toshinori Fukuzawa frequently over how they should advance the story. And while I don't doubt for a second this is a common practice with any sort of story-driven production, just based on some of the wording in this interview, it did give off the sense of a writer who was very apprehensive of her position, which I do believe was reflected in the show's overall writing, with random plot points thrown in spite of adding little actual story value. Hell, some of the more significant plot episodes, like the time travel one, felt more like they were added in out of necessity as they failed to build up anything properly, so may as well set up a literal plot device to get them out of the corner they had written themselves into.
Now, of course, a lot of this is speculative on our part, so maybe she did go into the show with some clear ideas, for better and for worse. Though, at the same time, I still do think she was the most ill-fit writer for this cooking anime, just based off of this little bit from the Animage interview.
When asked if she could cook, Sawako Hirabayashi responded with, "No, I can't, and I don't really like to cook at all, though I love eating, and I'm sure there are people out there like me, right? Maybe that'll change as we progress through this story, but I see no reason to put in such silly efforts in like that."
So, they got someone who doesn't even like cooking and finds it superfluous to improve her skills as she's writing for a cooking anime. I don't think I need to say any more.
I mean, I'll just come out and say it, I've really softened on Core of Precure over the past few years. Sure, I still think a lot of the writing was haphazard and poorly structured, but at the very least, I can say they really went all in on the cooking aspect, not only providing actual recipes likely thought up by professional patissiers who tried to make recipes doable for kids, but even dedicating significant chunks of episodes to figure out how they can improve their cooking. Meanwhile, with this show, I think we've only seen like a few brief instances of them cooking, and otherwise, for the most part, I think we just see them prepping. And other than one episode, they've never really had any discussions about the significance of the food they cook. Like, okay, I don't need them to go into long monologues about the historical and cultural significance about every food they eat, though it would be appreciated if they do it occasionally. But at the very least, why did these characters discuss what they did to make their food better? In moments like that, we could have had little character bits where we could see not just their passion towards cooking, but maybe even showing respect towards the person they're cooking for, making it in ways that they'd enjoy it more. Something, again, I have to admit, Kira did pretty well overall. But no, instead it's mostly just delicious smile. Translation, this food is delicious, which, yeah, duh. That really doesn't say much of anything, and just makes your character feel rather shallow when that's all they have to say.
Which, yeah, on that note, let's talk characters.
As always, we'll start with the villains, and in this case, we'll go with one of the most vile and evil of them all.
深いため息の原因はクレープじゃなく喧嘩したからだったのね。
No shit.
Okay, but seriously, let's talk about the narrator first, and how this was a very poorly executed idea.
Yeah, just so we're clear, I don't think narrators are inherently a bad thing, and depending on how you utilize them, they could even become one of the most fun aspects of a show.
Hell, some of my favorite examples come from anime, namely Okami-san and Hayate the Combat Butler. Now, I would say there are two big differences between these examples and this show. The narrators of Okami and Hayate were Satomi Arai and Norio Wakamoto respectively. The former has not only had a couple of previous roles in Precure, but also played Kuroko in a certain series. Meanwhile, Wakamoto needs no introduction. And while their deliveries were very different, with Arai putting on more of a whimsical fairy tale voice, and Wakamoto just having a booming, commanding voice that earns him the credit the voice of the heavens, they were both incredibly entertaining with their hammy deliveries. Like, you could just tell that both VAs were having a blast and really getting into their roles, resulting in fun time for everyone. Meanwhile, this show's narrator sounded exactly as you'd expect. A live-action actress, still fairly new to voice acting, trying to also put on a whimsical fairy tale voice, and yet never sounding as though she's totally comfortable in the VA booth. Personally, I thought her deliveries were very dry and generic, and just didn't really add much to the story, which brings us to our second difference, what they added to their shows. So, in all three of these cases, the narrators had omnipotent third-person views, with them seemingly knowing what's going to happen in the story and relaying it to us, the audience. While doing so, they also tried to bring in their own little touches. In both Arai and Wakamoto's case, they delivered their lines with a ton of wit and cynicism, to the point that they'd even break the fourth wall, and their words would reach the characters and often insult them. This would result in both some good comedy with the characters' reactions, and even a little insight to them, like hinting at the innocent-looking Ringo's toxic personality. Meanwhile, in this show, the narrator, except for one out-of-nowhere instance, never interacted with the characters and only directly talked to the audience. Now, that alone wouldn't be an issue, and just make her a bit more of a traditional narrator.
Hell, sometimes she would even have a little wit and would make me chuckle a little, but that wouldn't last, as then she would just keep on talking and talking and talking.
So, for our weekly reviews of this series, we had actually made up a little counting gag for every time the narrator would provide a distracting bit of exposition. Honestly, I did not think it would go as far as it did, but sure enough, it was with us until the very end. And while we did kind of play loose with it, sometimes pulling a CinemaSins by subtracting and doubling up on points, I think for the most part, we ended on an accurate number of at least 70 instances where the narrator would share info that didn't need to be shared. Things such as saying that Rosemary was sad, even though we could clearly see that. Explained that Amane was afraid of ghosts. Gee, I couldn't tell. Telling us that they were at an art museum.
Oh my god, do you not understand the point of a narrator?
And yeah, I could probably apply almost all of Cat Icarus's criticisms to the Peppa Pig narrator to this show.
They both treat their audiences like they have the attention span of amoebas, even though for almost 20 years, and other than some basic episode recaps, Precure has never needed a narrator to explain everything to them. This lady wasn't adding anything, and in fact was taking away from the ample visual language here that the show's animators and directors were actually doing a good job getting across. Worst of all was when in many of these cases, she ended up taking away from the emotional moments of these scenes. A good example being the aforementioned one and only time they broke the fourth wall during the final battle with Godatz. Now, to this show's credit, this was an incredibly hype scene with an awesome insert song and Yu Yoshiyama working her usual animated magic. However, it was taking down quite a few pegs when the narrator, aka Yui's grandmother Yone, cheered her granddaughter on and she thanked her. And this was right after she had just had a whole speech about how food connects everyone, even those who weren't with us anymore. Hell, she even tried to console Godatz over the passing of his master, and yet out of nowhere, she talks to her granny as though she had never left.
Needless to say, this narratively made little sense, and even worse, it felt a little insulting to those who have passed on, but more on that at the end.
Point is that while I understand this franchise trying something different, they just completely botched this. And honestly, I hope they never try this again, as I think it is clear that Toei has enough talented animators that they don't need a narrator to explain everything, though maybe some other people on staff did need her. Jeez, that section took a little while, but honestly, I'm also just not that interested in talking about the alleged villains of this show. I mean, for the most part, the Bundle Gang just wasn't well built up, in particular their leader Godatz, aka Fennel, and his second-in-command, Secretor. Both just didn't have that much of a strong presence in the show until they actually joined the battle, and even then, they were still underwhelming.
I think some of the commenters put it best when they said this is basically the law of diminishing returns.
I think the writers want to build up anticipation and intrigue for these characters, especially the big reveal of Fennel being Godatz, but because they appeared early on and didn't contribute that much to the ongoing plot, it just left the impression that we really shouldn't care that much about these two. Not helped by the fact that because they waited so long until near the end of the series, there simply wasn't enough time to really flesh out their motivations. Secretor seemingly had a falling out with her romantic partner due to her unexplained obsession with perfection in spite of her subpar cooking skills. And while I usually like vague storytelling, where the viewer has to make some of their own interpretations of the story, it doesn't really help when we're not attached to the character beforehand, especially one who's mostly just been a judgmental Karen throughout, which, yeah, this just kind of adds to that. And yet, I guess we were supposed to feel bad for this grown woman who pushed away people in her life due to her unexplained obsession with perfection. Seriously, it's telling when the thing that most people remember about Secretor was her very forced ship with Kokone's mom, which, yeah, all I'll say to that is no, just no. Married woman with a kid, just no. Godatz / Fennel fared a little better, but not by much. So this guy switched to the dark side out of a pay jealousy that he wasn't selected as the sole owner of his master's delicious stone twice. I mean, it's not one of the most nuanced villain motivations ever, but at least when he did become the final boss, he went all in on it, and his ultimate plan of declaring martial law over the world's food supply was solid. Still, that did make up for the weak build-up to this twist, as essentially it was a mystery where they backloaded most of the hints of who the culprit was, which is just plain bad writing. And then they also seemed to tack on that he was suffering from grief over the passing of his master, which even acted as the final means of bringing him back to the good side, which...
Isn't that cute? But it's wrong!
The dude started to become an evil dictator while Ginger was still alive and continued to scheme and plot well after his passing for 20 years. Anyone who holds on to that much malice for so long is and likely never was really that much of a rational person, and yet because they wanted to redeem him by the end, they did a worse version of the lazy witch's redemption.
Though really, the biggest issue with the Bundle Gang was how the writers really insisted on giving all of them redemption arcs.
I mean, putting aside Gentle, who we'll get to later, and Spiritor, who was just a robot who could be programmed for good or evil on the fly, there was no reason to turn all of these characters good. Yes, from the very beginning, this franchise has made it a point that some people can be redeemed, whilst also saying that some can't. There are just some monsters out there who can't be reasoned with and will only continue to lie and manipulate others to get what they want. And while we were never made privy to how the Bundle Gang was formed, like, at all, it's honestly kind of dangerous to assume someone like Fennel would change after 20 years worth of crimes. For every bad end trio, you do kind of need a Joker to act as a cautionary tale, especially for this show's target audience.
Ooh boy, Darizen, that's almost too good an example. I mean, just imagine if they tried to redeem a similar character. Oh wait.
Now, I'm not gonna lie, Narcissist was, and still kind of is, my favorite antagonist of the show. He was a ruthless sadist who I think was strongly implied to have brought Amane into their gang through his brainwashing. Again, I don't recall any confirmation, we're just kind of making assumptions, I think. Regardless, he was ruthless, though with a humanizing moment coming from a brief flashback that seemed to imply that he was an outsider due to some sort of inability to enjoy food. Well, okay, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't excuse his actions, but it does give him a Freudian excuse, so this could lead to something interesting, especially if it involves some sort of severe eating disorder, and it turns out he's just a picky eater.
That's it! That's it! Lame!
Like, I'm not saying that picky eaters don't have their own issues. I can certainly attest, as I was one as a kid, resulting in some unhealthy eating habits, but I never really felt ostracized because of it. A lot of other things cover that.
Not to mention, it doesn't really match up with this gray symbolism from the flashback, which of course implies emptiness, like maybe an inability to taste food, which yes, very much is a thing, and in many cases is impossible to fix. Wouldn't that work a lot better in a show where the characters just go on and on about how everything is delicious, which would understandably aggravate him, and maybe even make the protagonist reflect on how they live such privileged lives? But okay, maybe they want to prioritize a more common issue that their target audience would face, fair enough.
So maybe they'll give some good advice on how to overcome it, like how I realized how unhealthy my diet of mostly junk food was, and how much actually good food I was missing out on.
And they give him a candy apple, and almost instantly he's a good guy now. I mean, put aside how insanely rushed that face turn was, to the point that it really should have resulted in his face coming off, to say the solution to fixing picky eating habits is eating candy and later cake in the final episode is not only insane, but also kind of harmful in the sense that if kids took this seriously, they might figure the solution to their poor eating habits is just eating more junk food. But yeah, overall for me at least, I think Narcissist was the most disappointing character of the season. I mean, I'm not saying a villain has to be the most well-written character of a show, but not only was this guy's face turn handled very poorly, it also kind of felt offensively unearned considering what he did to Amane, at least including brainwashing and objectifying her on several occasions, and yet we're supposed to cheer the fact that he's a good guy by the end.
How about new?
And yet, him and most of the Bundle Gang got redemptions, in spite of never really earning it, as this show wanted to be the most comforting season, not realizing the damage that sort of mindset could do to your story in the long run that we'll talk more about at the end. Moving on to the side characters, the energy fairies were just kind of there for the most part.
I mean, yeah, I don't think it's fair to compare them with, say, the healing animals, as from the very beginning, they were planning on giving the lion's share of focus to the fox, but at the same time, why were these two even here?
Aside from that awful time travel twist and the very occasional advice to their partners, Pom Pom, and especially Memdragon, didn't really contribute much of anything to the show. Hell, even in the movie where all the advertisements made a big freaking deal of them gaining human forms, they again played like a second, or rather third fiddle to Kokone and her partner. Though with all that in mind, maybe the Fox Fairy made up all the difference.
Nope.
Due to still being a developing toddler, Kokone was always going to be the baby of the group, even at her quote-unquote most mature stage, which, yeah, other than her human form's appearance, really wasn't that much different of a character. I think one of the most aggravating moments for this character was when she said that she was trying to grow up fast to be more of a help for her team, even though each of her growth spurts were random and forced, that even the characters themselves lampshaded it. You can't have it both ways, show. Not to mention, really? She was always trying to help the team? Yeah, thanks again for telling and not showing, and no, the examples they show weren't her actively helping the team. Hell, just a few episodes back, she drove Pom Pom away with her over-entitlement over being the only one with a human form. And yet, everyone just forgave her brightness and constantly praised her, even when it wasn't really called for. But then again, she also did have some pretty game-breaking powers, like creating their final upgrades and the time travel, plus the convenient automatic memory erasure, so yeah, does that qualify her as a Mary Sue? Honestly, I don't know, and frankly, I don't care, as it's clear that these mascots were mostly just here to sell toys, and yet they didn't even do a good job at that.
Then again, maybe it was just a bad idea to try and compete with Digimon's Vilebrace. I mean, I know I'd want to buy my kid a Fitbit rather than this overpriced junk.
moving on to the thing that they overall might have overpushed a little, likely due to the head writer's preferences, we got the boys. And to be clear, I'm not against more male representation in this franchise. Yeah, I know it sounds inherently counterintuitive in a magical girl show, but between the many male fairies and even supporting human characters, I see no major issue with bringing more lads in. Case in point, Rosemary was one of the most well-received characters of the season, and rightfully so.
He also seemed to provide some good LGBTQ representation, which I didn't really care either way. I mean, I don't think they did much with it in the end. But at the same time, I am glad that they didn't pull Movie War Ultimatum and made his sexuality the punchline to a really bad joke.
Granted, he was still the butt of many jokes, though probably more due to the fact that he sounded like the manager from Blend S. Anyway, as a mentor character, he didn't have or really needed a significant arc of a sort, but he still was very much Laird, being a soldier who initially tried to remind Yui to take being a Precure seriously, and while nothing much came of that, he was still very much an active member of the team, both issuing commands and even getting involved with some fisticuffs, which was impressive considering that for most of the season, he didn't have much in the way of combat-oriented superpowers. He did unfortunately have the delicious feel, though that's a discussion for later. And regardless, he was still a great adult character, aside from his poor spending habits. Seriously, just because your head writer stands takeout doesn't mean you have to too. Conversely, we have the character who, in spite of getting some top billing for a non-cure character, was both kind of under and yet also overused, Takumi aka Black Pepper. Now obviously, he was supposed to be an XP of Mamoru Chiba being a matched love interest for the lead magical girl, but that didn't quite pan out as his relationship with Yui never really developed into anything significant. Granted, a lot of it wasn't our boy's fault, as his love interest had a much deeper love for Rice, but even then, he seldom tried to up their relationship, resulting in a tiresome will-they-won't-they subplot. All the while, I'm just left shaking my head at how much money this poor kid is wasting on her food bills. And yet, in spite of that very lackluster love storyline, he did also have some of the most interesting conflicts of the show, including living up to his father's cookfire heritage, which later developed into a very personal vendetta against Godatz after learning how much he had screwed over his poor father's life.
By all means, at times like this, he really did feel like the main protagonist, as he did have a very understandable gripe against the main antagonist, something that our actual protagonist lacked.
This resulted in the aforementioned bit of the Cookfires taking over the final arc of the show, in spite of it not being their show, and them not even really getting that much individual character development to warrant it. Really, it's almost insane how disjointed and imbalanced Takumi and the Cookfires were in this show's main plot.
And in the fact that they're all guys taking over a girl's show, and yeah, that's just a tad bit problematic.
Look, I still want to believe that Cure Wing is going to be a good addition to the Precure franchise, if only so that they can correct the mistakes of this show. With that, let's finally get into the main characters of this pretty Cure show. Starting with the Sixth Ranger, Amane Kasai, aka Gentle, aka Cure Finale. And honestly, the most memorable persona of those three was the relatively short-lived villainess. I mean, just on top of having easily the best design in this whole show, hero or villain, Gentle at least felt like a unique antagonist who could use her position as the student council president to mess with our heroines.
However, things quickly went south after she took off her mask for the first time, and the parade of comparisons with other Sixth Rangers started and never really stopped.
Now, as we went over in the aforementioned toy duality video, repeating old story beats aren't necessarily the problem, but they shouldn't be your only building blocks to your character, like it was with Amane, whose face turn feels like an amalgamation of every other evil Sixth Ranger minus the gripping backstories. Yeah, over the course of the entire show, we were never informed how exactly she ended up in the Bundle Gang, be it the result of her own hubris like Toa, or a trap like it was with Tommy Oliver. Thus, Amane's arc of atoning for her time as Gentle rang incredibly hollow when, for all we know, she was just as much a victim as anyone else. Not to mention, we didn't even get to know who Amane Kasai was beforehand, mostly just Gentle, so there was little to get invested in wanting to see her turn. Now again, maybe we did miss out on a couple of episodes due to the hack, but even if they had been significant, I doubt they would have had that much of an effect on the episodes that came after, which varied from just okay-ish one-offs, like her teach her friends manners, to the stuff with Narcissist. Yeah, part of the reason why candy apples were supposedly the cure to his picky eating was because they were made by Cure Finale as a means of resolving their incredibly rushed rivalry. I mean, from what little we know, it was at least his tech that brainwashed Amane in the first place, and even afterwards, he kept abusing and gaslighting the poor girl. And yet, she was willing to put all that aside after just one bit of praise about her apples. And people wonder why I like Nodoka vs. Darizen so much. But yeah, even factoring in the hack, Amane really was just a walking stereotype of a Sixth Ranger without much character of her own to speak of, as the latter half of the show really did just kind of forget about her. Like, do you even remember that she had a pseudo-partner in the Parfait Fairy? No? Well, not surprising, because it only appeared in like 3 episodes. Sometimes it's just better to skip dessert if they're just going to be empty calories anyway. Next up, we have my OTP for Nodoka, Ron Hanamichi, aka Cure Yum Yum. She was kind of a confusing character, and not in the sense that she was weird, that went without saying. I'm more referring to the fact that some of her character traits were almost paradoxical with the other. Early on, alongside Yui, she was established as being not particularly book smart, and yet also some sort of genius inventor later. I mean, I'm not saying someone who's bad at school can't have a brilliant mind, but it felt more than a little tacked on when it was barely referenced in the show, and moreover, detracted from what should have gotten more attention, her social media affinity. With that character trait, they did build some interesting episodes around it, like encouraging online safety when Gentle starts stalking her on Instagram, I mean Kirsta. But it also led to her final Spotlight episode being about her considering becoming a influencer as a career path, which, on top of giving us this horrifying depiction of a guest star character, really felt like they were glorifying what's currently one of the most overcrowded and nepotistic career fields out there right now.
I mean, unless you have the right connections or are extremely lucky, you're just gonna end up as a Z-list YouTuber complaining about magical girls all day. Damn it.
Not to mention, a message like this from an entity as corporate as Toei feels about as phony as Bob Iger handing out a list of hashtags. Regardless, Ron, while lacking a little focus due to often being paired off with her fellow remedial course student, wasn't a bad character. In spite of being able to write long and detailed food blog posts, when it came to live streaming, she was a nervous wreck. Now, in a moment like this, you could read into her being on the spectrum, and other events do kind of back that up, but one, I think this season has a much better representation of such, who we'll get to in just a sec, but also, this plot point was done much better with the other food season's Yellow Cure. Still, I will say that she is my second favorite cure of the season for at least pulling off the joke character much better than her leader, and occasionally bringing in some good social commentary, along with the bad. On a side note, I didn't realize Tatemoti's design was based off of Gao Sone's younger years. Probably should have noticed that when I used that Kamen Rider Kiva clip. Oops. But with that, we move on to everyone's favorite heroine of the season, Kokone Fua, aka Cure Spicy. And, yeah, I have to kind of agree. I mean, I'm not saying that just because I do appreciate possible neurodivergent representations, even if they have been kind of overused in this franchise, like, I don't think we need this much representation. Still, intentional or not, Kokone was a good representation of the socially awkward aspect of autism, with her even actively choosing solitude until meeting Yui. I like this aspect, as they didn't completely denounce her choice to be a loner, but also pointed out that she might be missing out on a lot by not opening up more. And while her initial attempts at becoming more sociable failed miserably, which is probably one of the most overly realistic aspects of this show, she did eventually succeed, giving us some sweet moments, which were made even better when we got more context to her loner tendencies, like how her auntie Karen encouraged the still very young Kokone to not be too demanding over just wanting some donuts for dessert. Though, kind of on that note, she had also been a picky eater towards bell peppers, which again, I can attest to as a trait of Asperger's. And not only did this episode happen before a Narcissist reveal, but it was handled a lot better, with her actually sucking it up and trying the food that she didn't like at first. Seriously, how could they mess up this character so much? But yeah, Kokone certainly benefited from having most of her episodes being written by the one veteran, Mutsumi Ito. about her only really subpar episode was unfortunately her last Spotlight episode, as it was a very cliched moving away plot that hadn't been hinted at or built up to like in other seasons, and made little practical sense to commission Kokone's parents to make local foods for a foreign nation when you could just send your local chefs to study abroad in Japan. Still, at least the character had a consistent arc of her trying to open up more to others, which was handled very nicely. I personally don't think she's necessarily a great blue, and certainly not one of the best out there, as even now we're getting one of the best of the franchise, but still, easily the most solidly written character of this otherwise very disjointed season. However, from the highs, we now go straight to the lows with Yui Nagomi, aka Cure Precious. Now look, I don't necessarily hate this character for the most part, but I do consider it to be one of the worst leads of this franchise, if only on the grounds that she's not much of a leader, as she seldom takes charge of anything. She is incredibly reactionary to the point that some of the early plot points didn't really get started because of her, but rather guys like Takumi and Rosemary. Sure, she'll be impulsively heroic sometimes, like in the first episode, which led to her becoming a Precure, but otherwise, just as she was warned against by Rosemary, she seldom took her job that seriously, and instead mostly chose to just eat, and eat, and eat. No wait, she also quoted her grandmother all the time, and I know I keep using this Yu-Gi-Oh clip, but it bears repeating. This trait really ended up hampering any actual character development for this Pink, as it became almost entirely her only moral compass. Words and quotes that didn't even belong to her and inherently couldn't apply to every single situation.
Basically, she was able to go through most of the series just on cruise control, which, needless to say, doesn't make for the most interesting of characters.
Every Precure, and especially the leaders, will go all out of their way to try and understand their friends and enemies alike. It's what allows them to improve and maintain their team morale, and sometimes even win over the baddies to their side. Sure, they won't bat 1,000 every time, but when they did, that just made those scenes all the more powerful. Meanwhile, Yui didn't really even have to worry about this stuff, as for one, the series' main conflict never really picked up until the very tail end, so her team didn't have to worry about maintaining morale, and two, stuff like the Gentle Face Turn arc only really started because, as I just said, Takumi brought up his hypothesis of why she was good all along, not Yui. Hell, the fact that she was oblivious to Takumi's feelings towards her really showed how little she even tried to understand her so-called childhood friend, who she had ignored for much of the series, and when she did remember he existed, it was mostly just to give him more food orders, and yet she never questioned why he spent so much time and money on her.
I'm almost tempted to make the obvious joke of comparing her with plain white rice that requires other things to actually be any good, but you know, at least rice provides you with calories to promote activity.
Now, of course, they could have done something interesting with even her granny obsession subplot, which they did start to do at the tail end of the series. Again, there's that backwards writing. After being her grandmother in the past, Yui was finally awoken to the fact that depending on the person and situation, her granny quotes were nothing more than empty platitudes. In this case, her teammate on the soccer team told her. Oh yeah, she was part of the soccer team. Almost forgot, since they only really brought up in this episode and the first. Thus, she did try to move away from her grandmother and create her own core beliefs, with only 4 episodes left in the show, as opposed to building a lengthy and engaging arc around it like other Pink leads. Not too surprisingly, this didn't work out so well, both narratively and literally, as she tried to apply her still very shallow ideals to Godatz, believing a guy she had only spoken to a few times could be easily reasoned with, and not just turn out to be a dangerously psychotic dictator. And honestly, I couldn't bring myself to feel bad for Yui at this moment, as not only was she grossly underdeveloped, but I also knew she wasn't really going to learn anything from this, and sure enough, what ends up bringing her out of her stupor? Takumi and more granny quotes.
Well, of course.
Yui just embodies why I think this is such a subpar season. Her lackadaisical attitude towards everything prevented the show's conflict from really escalating, and therefore its plot from ever really progressing.
But that's just what happens when one of the main creators seems to have little interest in actually writing for magical girls.
Again, this is more me posturizing, but I think Sawako Hirabayashi was more interested in creating a show of her own preferences rather than actually writing a Precure. Those preferences being writing for shonen like Kuroko's basketball, hence why a lot of the plot wasn't really progressed by our titular heroines, but rather by these side male characters in the Cookfires who, almost completely separate from them, were the ones unraveling Fennel's conspiracies and likely forced his hand at the end of the series. And her other preference was referencing her former mentor and producer in Toshiki Inoue, who at the time of the show's airing was having a bit of a career renaissance with the aforementioned Dome brothers. This could be seen in Yui's hand gesture here, which was clearly taken from the titular lead of Kamen Rider Kabuto, Soji Tendo, whenever he quoted his granny, and that time travel episode was likely based off of a similar plot in Kamen Rider Kiva, where the lead Wataru also went back to see a parental figure, in his case his late father. Both shows had Inoue as a major writer, and while I personally wouldn't call them great Kamen Rider seasons, I do think Inoue handled his characters well enough for what they were. Meanwhile, by trying to lift directly from these characters while lacking many of their unique nuances, like how Tendo only used his granny quotes as a point of reference, or how Wataru being his dad was built up over the course of the whole series, Yui was left as a shallow imitation of the two, as she didn't have much to work with due to Sawako being too busy writing a shonen love letter to Inoue senpai.
Going back to what we said in the intro, I've heard people make the argument that hey, it's a show for kids and it's okay if it's a little more easygoing and low stakes.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, what he said.
I mean, let's consider what are some of the main morals and themes this show tried to get across. Did it try to promote healthy eating? Well, they did have that one bell pepper episode, and they made potato salad in one episode, something that even Garfield promoted.
Just so long as you eat something.
And yet, by that same token, Yui consumed just as much as that obese orange cat, in particular, a lot of carbs and sugars to the point diabetes should just be around the corner waiting. Seriously, if that bread is like the real life equivalent, which are each 181 kilocalories, and she ate 4 of them, that's 724 kilocalories, almost half the daily recommended intake of someone of Yui's age. Did we learn more about cooking, or even how certain foods came about? Well, there was that one episode that took a look at traditional Japanese confections and their history, and they even threw in a really touching little tale about accepting how all good things come to an end. However, that was pretty much the only episode focused on food history. As Sawako herself has attested, she wasn't interested in learning more about cooking, and instead wanted to focus more on eating out, which is also an unhealthy eating habit and will drain your finances.
I mean, just because you have low stakes doesn't mean you shouldn't have any at all. Otherwise, you're not really exploring any deeper ideas or morals that haven't even been handled better by other cooking anime.
I mean, we've already gone over how Kira Kira is the superior cooking anime in this franchise, but if you just wanted an entertaining show where they cook and highlight the histories and traits of certain foods, you could just go watch Yakitachi Japan or Food Wars. If you want a comforting show about people just enjoying cooking, you could watch Sweetness and Lightning. Or if you just want to watch cute girls eat, you could just go watch Gourmet Girl Graffiti, which even has Ron's VA playing a similar foodie character. Really, there's no reason for this show to exist, especially as a Precure, as it really botched their own concepts, as well as some of this franchise's own core values. According to an interview with series director Toshinori Fukuzawa, one of the confirmed major themes they were trying to get across in the show was the concept of gratitude, be it towards our friends and family in the now, or especially in this show's case, the people who have passed on. Now, this is a perfectly fine and even kind of profound message, but I think they might have overdone it.
While remembering and showing thanks to those who made us who we are is a great thing, we also do need to make our own dependence. To me, that is one of the core values of Precure.
Another reason I did not care for that sudden fourth wall break between Yuri and Yone during the final battle was that it pretty much signified that Yui will only ever be her granny's little girl. Even when she had claimed to move on from her, she still ended up going right back to literally holding on to her grandmother's ideals rather than forming her own. They pretty much make Yone a living character even in the present timeline, and while I get the message that our loved ones will always be watching down on us, which is nice and everything, but you know, we do have to accept that they're gone, as that is a part of growing up. As we said in the past, Precure series are pretty much coming-of-age stories where the characters will face allegorical or even sometimes literal representations of the future that await them. Meanwhile, this season, between the many punches they pulled to redeem the villains, or even just their sheer lack of narrative stakes or tension, made clear that this season wasn't just comfort food, it was junk food. Food that tastes good at first, but after a while it just gets tiring and eventually starts to rot your brain.
To me, Delicious Party Precure is an absolute fluff season that doesn't really fill me with hate, hence why I don't consider it to be the worst season, but at the same time, it just kind of fills me with apathy.
It was a season that I think even Toei didn't really care about and were more focused on just finishing up their other projects and working on their anniversary season. That's likely why the animation took a noticeable downturn, with a lot more episodes being outsourced to Studio Gallop, hence the Yu-Gi-Oh!-esque faces, and Beijing. As such, and along with the lowest revenue of the franchise, Toei will likely have little reason to even remember this series even happened, so I think I'll just do the same. It's a below average 4 out of 10, bordering on 3 with how much the narrator annoyed me, but ultimately, it's just a series I'm not gonna bother with after this video. I will thank this show for the occasional tasty bits of good visuals and storytelling, but otherwise, I think I'm just gonna go back to watching Dio pull off his best Gamera impersonation.
Thanks for watching, and as always, do feel free to like and subscribe for more.
We'll of course continue to cover the so far superior Hirogaru Sky on the weekly reviews, and make more lengthy videos like this.
Definitely gonna need more of that coffee that we make in the buffer, but until next time though, for now, my friends, and remember, if at all possible, just try and make your own food. Now, where did I leave that instant ramen?